Joining us now from The Guardian and from the Read Optional Substack. Those are the two things I should say, right?
That's correct.
Is our good buddy, Ollie Connolly. Ollie, how you doing, man?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm excited to finally do this. We were supposed to do it last week, and I am incapable of understanding how time zones work. And typically, I would assume that I would find a sympathetic ear on the other end of that. We've all run into that before. But unfortunately, I'm dealing with the man who lives in the UK and operates on Eastern time. So the fact that you gave me even the slightest bit of a pass for screwing this up is a level of graciousness on your part that was totally unnecessary.
Thank you very much. I do deal with it my daily life. No one ever knows what time I'm on. They think I don't know what time they're on. You somehow confuse Central and Eastern. An amazing thing to do.
What happened was, in my mind, 3 p.m. Eastern is 2 o'clock.
Mm-hmm.
That in my life, 3 p.m. Eastern is 2 o'clock always. And so when I schedule things on Eastern time still to make it easy for other people. So I was in Atlanta last week and we had decided to record at 3 p.m. Eastern. Well, in my mind, 3 p.m. Eastern is 2 o'clock. The problem was I was in a place where it is 3 o'clock. So it is a completely unacceptable mistake and 100% on me. But if we're trying to trace how it happened, that is how it happened.
And we finally made it. Look at us.
We did. We finally made it. And we are about to do a division as part of this lingering question series that I don't know if it's the division I was most looking forward to, but it's definitely one of the juiciest divisions that you could dive into as part of this exercise, because I think there are some really relevant questions that need answering about really good teams. You know, when we do the NFC West next week, there are going to be questions worth answering about the Arizona Cardinals because no one watched the Arizona Cardinals. But with teams like the Dolphins, with teams like the Jets, with teams like the Bills, these are teams that want to make the playoffs. They're teams that want to make noise. And I think that these lingering questions about them could have a real impact on what happens in 2024. So I was very excited that you wanted to do this one because I felt like there was a lot for us to chew on.
Yeah, I mean, we have 3 teams with championship expectations who expect to be lifting a Lombardi when we get to February. And they are all, I would say, in really unusual places with a ton of things left over from last season, to say the least. So how they go about answering that, what the process to answer that, whether they believe their process was right last season and just the results weren't there, I think will be really fascinating, and we'll have answers really quickly when the season begins.
All right, let's kick this off. Let's start with the Miami Dolphins because that's the order that my notes are in for no other good reason than that. What is your lingering question from 2023 about the Miami Dolphins?
My big question for them is what will their blitz rate look like next season? They were one of the highest pressure groups in the league last year with 4. And they kind of really changed their defense as the season went along, right? From being pretty sim heavy, kind of new age, kind of following the modern trends, the Mike McDonald path, which is the defense they'll be running this season. But as the year went along, as they had those injuries, they kind of just reverted back to Fangio type, which was just, we'll play 4 down, we'll show some interesting stuff. But for the most part, we are a 4-man rush team. That's where we're getting a ton of pressure. We need the help on the back end. And so now they're moving into this new world where it's a lot more hybrid, a lot more movement between positions, bunch more standing up, way more sims. And how are they going to balance that understanding of, we were really successful just running a 4 down and go group, but do we philosophically want to be more of a blitz oriented sim creeper pressure type team? And do we even have the pieces to run that style of defense, or are we better off taking the long-term view, rolling over what worked at the back end of last season, slowly integrating new stuff as we go along?
It's really interesting because when you said you wanted to talk about this, my first thought was, well, if you look at just the overall numbers, a lot of the stuff that the Dolphins were doing last year and who they were aligns with who the Ravens were last year. 2 specific examples. The Dolphins finished 27th in blitz rate last season. The Ravens finished 26th. Cover 0 rates. And you talk about some of those mugged up fronts. And when I went back and I watched a lot of pre-Jalen Phillips injury stuff because I wanted to see what they were doing when everyone was healthy. And like you said, there was a lot of mugged up looks, a lot of simulated pressures, a lot of stunts, a lot of weirdness, even if they were only bringing 4. And if you look at it, last year, the Dolphins ran cover 0 on 6.5% of their plays. The Ravens ran it on 6.6% of their plays, which is both like a top 5-ish rate. So at first glance, to me, there's a lot of carryover between who the Ravens were last season and who the Dolphins were last season and how those things can kind of intermingle. But for you, if you go one layer deeper to some of the granularity behind those numbers, you think that there's more inconsistencies to potentially figure out.
Yeah, I think so. And losing Wilkins is the huge thing. They were probably the
Mhm.
best latch team in the league last year, as in can one guy grab two defenders so one guy pops free. That's the whole idea, right? Of simming things up.
Yeah.
He might be the number one in the entire NFL. Madubuike, him, those like the top guys to
In a
just pull
post
that
Justin
out
Smith world.
in a post Justin Smith world, to just rip that guy out radically alters what are we actually going to do inside. And the other big layer is so much of how the Ravens get to their stuff flows off what they do with the nickel and having some kind of hybrid defender who can play safety, play dime linebacker. You go through the Dolphins and say, do we have a true elite perimeter on the edge nickel who can fit the run, who can be a true pressure guy for us? They may do, but it's a huge open question. So it's just the mechanics of how they're getting to the sim stuff. Like you said, the totals line up really well, but the mechanics of what they're doing is pretty different. The depth the linebackers have to play out, what you want in that hybrid role, what Kyle Hamilton obviously brought for the Ravens as a complete cheat code. It's kind of the three hinge pieces of what that defense wants to be is true nickel who can play as a big slot, hybrid safety, and a linebacker who is just a complete freak in the vertical plane. Tons of wingspan, can cover, can blitz, all that stuff. I'm not quite sure you go through the roster. Those are the three pieces you say lock that in. That's definitely what they've got. What they have more than anything is if everyone's healthy, we can just rush the passer. We can just play 4 down and go. So it's like, what do you want to do philosophically versus what gets the best out of the roster?
As I think about the best moments from what that Miami pass rush looked like last year, I'm thinking about certain packages where they have things mugged up with Jalen Phillips bumped inside. So you have Phillips walked over one guard, you have a linebacker walked over the other guard. And one, that allows you to get your 3 best pass rushers on the field, whether that's Chop Robinson in a sub role this year when you bump Phillips inside and Chubb's out there as well. And two, I love Jalen Phillips in stunts and games as an interior player. So as I'm thinking about the best application of those guys, those are kind of the fronts I have in mind on 3rd and 8, where you have him bumped inside and you have a linebacker walk down and you can live in that kind of twist in game world. Is that an outcome that you think would be ideal for where they are right now? Or are you seeing this play out a different way if things are going right for them?
That's certainly the most exciting way. That's what I would like to watch on Sundays and be able to study on a Monday. I think Chop Robinson is one of the strangest prospects from this recent class. I think he's kind of pigeonholed as the get off and go, dip and rip speed rush around the edge. That's kind of what the measurables are. That's kind of how he was profiled and framed. I thought he was way better when he was playing inside. I think when you watched him against Michigan, lined head up over the center, lined up either side of the center, just the elite burst, the snap, the suddenness, the oh my God, what do we do-ness is where he created a ton of havoc. And I actually think in the NFL, he's really not as great at the top of the arc as you would want him to be as a closer. I would way prefer just saying our best asset with you is the burst off the ball. Doesn't matter how bad the fundamentals are. That's where you can create havoc. So if you can pair him and Phillips together and flip-flop back and forth, you're stood up inside, you're playing outside. That, to me, that kind of marriage of those two together, their skill sets, and how you could move them around is where we would maybe have the most fun.
I love that because that's my biggest issue with him is that he's just getting pushed past guys at the top of the rush so often because he doesn't have that speed to power sort of conversion that you want. And it's also such a departure from these two guys that he's playing with. You have these monster guys. And, Phillips is not a traditional rusher in the sense that he's not a bend the corner sort of player, but he is so big and strong. And obviously Bradley Chubb is that as well. So it'd be almost counterintuitive that you would slide the smallest, kind of most undersized one of those three inside. But in your mind, that actually might be the best way for this to play out.
Yeah, I think so. Look, if you're moving into this world, which they evidently are, which is we're crowding the line with 6 or 7 and 4 are coming, and you got to figure out, who is coming in from where. The biggest thing you want is shock factor, is the suddenness off the ball. That is way more important than speed to power, any kind of the technical mechanics you would get when you're kind of down one in the pass rush, right? Or you're trying to build out a different style of pressure plan. Just worrying, fear for the line and for the quarterback is like the number one thing you want. Just concerned that they're coming because you wouldn't expect him to ever drop. You think he's going to burst off the ball, but it's one thing to know he's coming when it's that quick and it's in that tight quarters and it's a guard panicking on, oh God, what do I do? I'll help. Oh no, Jalen Phillips is coming free. that seems like a quicker path to effectiveness. Maybe not developing the player, which is not great for Chop, I guess, and maybe not what you would envisage when you take a guy and think he's going to be the swooper off the edge. But just in terms of like that third down, what can he do for us year one, weeks 1 to 8, as we try and grind out wins? That to me would be way more effective.
We're talking about the ways we think it could play out and the ways that would be fun for it to play out. If you had to make a bet on what they will try to do and what they will try to be, where would you drift on that?
I think they'll go full Ravens. I think they'll take those first 7 weeks and say, when healthy, these guys can do it. Losing Wilkins is just, it's hard to overstate the need for that guy in that defense right in the middle, right? Both in terms of what it means for them in the run game. They're playing down in the run game a lot. That's why they bring the nickel so consistently. So you're putting a lot of emphasis on what can we find in the middle. Is our nickel good enough? So that is a risk. But I think they'll bet on what they evaluate from those first few weeks of last season.
All right, let's get to the other side of the ball with the Miami Dolphins, because one of the biggest questions I had coming into this entire exercise for all 32 teams that I wanted to dig into, because I think we didn't really pay attention to it in the moment for 2 reasons. One, Tua played so poorly in that game against the Chiefs that I think it became a Tua referendum set of conversations after that playoff game. And 2, I think Spags and the defense beat the shit out of them to such a degree that it kind of started that the rumble of the Spags celebration that kind of kept unfolding over the course of the playoffs. But I wanted to take a bigger step back, and independent of the quarterback, why does the Miami offense keep running into walls near the end of the season? Like, why does this team continue to struggle down the stretch and play their worst football in January and into the playoffs? So if you were kind of trotting out an initial hypothesis about what that would be, where would you start?
Well, this is one I would like to do an 8-part narrative series with Jordan if The Athletic would like to commission that, because this is one of the biggest things that I just sit around in bed at night pondering about, as sad as I am. Last season, the season before is injury to Tua. I think that's a fair enough diagnosis to put there. And I think last season is the injury to the offensive line. And not in just the traditional ways, but in what that meant just mechanically for the entire offense, the way they built themselves throughout the season. I don't buy into the narrative that they're showing too much early in the year. I think it's kind of when you dig into that, as you may want to, the argument falls apart really quickly. I think what happened last season is they lose their starting center. The offensive line gets completely decimated. They try then to overhaul what they're doing in the run game and how that layers into the rest of the offense. And the fact that they lost that offensive line and lost the ability, frankly, to run the ball. My data dogs don't like when I hammer on talking about running the ball and what that does for you as just holistically for the offense. But them losing that capacity and how they were running the ball more so than the fact that they were running the ball undermined every other core component of the offense, mostly the cheat motion, all the fun and games, the shenanigans, the bullshit they run in the passing game. It just made all that stuff really easy for defenses. You could just sit and say, the only answer to the cheat motion is we're rocking into quarters. We've got no hope. We're trying to leverage the ball, all that classic stuff. When you do that normally and you just play in a light box, you can get mauled by the run. And they maul people versus light boxes early in the season. Once the injuries happen, they couldn't maul people anymore against light boxes in the run. So it no longer became a guessing game for opposing defenses of, can we risk living in quarters for as long as possible against all this nonsense they're running on the other side of the ball? And that just became an easy remedy, and then allowed them to do all the things that we know has been a problem for them for years now, which is if they cannot just obliterate the middle of the field, Tua struggles throwing outside the numbers. He can't create off script, and the whole house of cards starts falling down.
Yeah, I think that the outside the number stuff and the differentiation in the run game, those are the 2 things I landed on. If you watch what they do on outside runs, it's magnificent. And not just the success on it, and not just the way that aligns with the running back skill sets, the different ways that they've been able to coach guys to find and seal edges. And if you watch those tight ends specifically in the perimeter run game, you would think that they're some of the best blocking tight ends in the entire league. It's insane. Even guys like Julian Hill and what he's doing when he's slicing across the formation and just their ability to play on angles on those sorts of runs specifically, they're absolutely devastating on those plays. The problem is we've seen this happen with the Shanahan world in San Francisco, and we've seen this happen with McVay. As more and more teams are starting to play your outside run game and put a focus on stopping that, you need a counterpunch, sometimes literally, with your gap scheme running game. And they don't have one, or at least to this point, they have not developed one. And I think that there are 2 different layers to this. One, They don't do it as often. 2, like you mentioned, it's hard to start building on your run game when you're changing out component pieces of the offensive line. You're literally just trying to survive. But if that's my question, though, they didn't add to the line. It's the same group that's coming back this year. Even when healthy, I don't think they're necessarily set up to have downhill counterpunches in the running game with the group as currently constructed. So I think at some point they're going to need to find those. And I just don't know, as the way they're built right now, if they're set up to potentially get there.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. I mean, they just philosophically don't believe in allocating resources to it, right? And so it's hard to just come down. And the same with the Niners. It's like, we think we coach it. It's technique. It's how it functions as a collective. It's not about just having individual maulers. We'd rather just have a great group and a settled group, ideally. So it's hard to push back against that when you just know they don't believe that the way I might believe that. It's like, at what point are we just kind of fighting in a room over that? So I think schematically, it was really compelling last year. They did really interesting things. So this thing's about McDaniels either running out of ideas or getting found out. He really tried to change things in the middle.
I would 100% agree with that, by the way. One of my biggest takeaways when rewatching this shit is like his ability to try to iterate on the things that he does well is magnificent. It's fascinating to watch him just pull away more and more layers to keep trying to pick away at what they do well.
And the thing that stood out last year, so early in the year, they did run a above normal amount of gap scheme stuff. And the play action stuff off that was some of the most explosive stuff in the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
Trinity test Oppenheimer scene type shit. Just bombs all over the place. And they just punish people. Light box, punish you, gap scheme. As the season goes along, they actually drop off massively in terms of paper play running the gap scheme stuff. They just didn't trust it anymore. They're like, these guys aren't good enough. But he tries to find really creative ways, which in a coaching clinic on a whiteboard is like, oh shit, this guy is the best in the business. They are running what looks like zone scheme type stuff. So I don't even know how these different sites have gone through and charted this stuff, right? But essentially the first level of the line of scrimmage, they are hinging and moving like a zone, like a gap run, but there's no puller or mover. The puller, in quotes, the power stuff, creating a two-man service, comes from the backfield. They start using Ingle, they start using receivers. It is really creative, iterative, cool stuff. And he already has all the layered stuff on top of it, all the RPOs there, all the play action stuff. In like 3 weeks, he's like, I have a brand new run game. That is wild. So there was no like, I've run out of ideas, everyone's found me out. He created a brand new thing that was not being run anywhere else in the league in 3 weeks, and it was semi-effective. They just couldn't have all the other stuff around it. The deep play action stuff started to fall apart. Their drop back game was actually fine and solid and was right around the normal level as before, but when they are really humming, it is the classic layer run game RPO play action. That is when they are at their best, and when they lost that element of the run game, the element of fear, it allowed everyone to back up, it allowed everyone to congest the middle of the field, and that's when they just don't have the answer, and that's when you get to the Tua side of things.
The different iterations on what looks like a zone run initially and then comes back into a gap scheme run. There was something they were doing late in the year where they would send one of the tight ends across like the same way that you would where they're changing the strength really quickly on those outside runs. But instead, he bounced back and then inserted on a downhill run. And it was Julian Hill a couple different times. And when you look at the X's and O's on the chalkboard, like you're mentioning, it's beautiful. Like it makes perfect sense. It's an ideal complement to what you're already doing. But then you watch him try to block someone one-on-one downhill, and that's where it all starts to fall apart. And so I'm watching this Chiefs game, and he's inserting on a linebacker, and even though the way it's drawn up, they're blocking it perfectly, they don't have the bodies to make it work. And then that extends to the offensive line, where you have these guys who, when they're moving in space, are actually pretty decent players. But I'm watching Austin Jackson try to block down on Chris Jones, and there's just nothing happening there. So that becomes my biggest concern, is whether or not we can have an alignment between the ideas that they're trying and the people that they have running those ideas, and whether or not they can ever make good on that creativity because they have the bodies. And the past, go ahead.
The thing for me is they were way more simplistic early in the season when they were housing everyone. They were fourth in EPA per play. You go through some of the real granular EPA per play numbers, running with a lead blocker, fourth in EPA per play, and it's like, oh great, they were dominant with a lead blocker. But the kind of runs they were doing is the most basic day one install high school stuff, right? When they get more, they basically tried to get more complex to overcome the fact they were losing guys everywhere. And then the numbers collapse off. So I will be more concerned if my staff, and this is no shot to anyone in particular, but someone like a Mike McCarthy, who I actually think is a slightly underrated guy in terms of where the ebb of the game and scheme is going and racing to get there as quick as everyone else. But you would never have faith in him coming up with a new offense in 3 weeks to try and solve problems. The fact that McDaniel was like, I have a huge talent problem now. We're not good enough anymore. Let me try and find a solution. Even though it did not work, I would rather have a coach who was willing to try and find and adjust and find different things than someone who just pounds their head against the wall with a somewhat rudimentary offense full of motion and smoke screens, knowing they don't quite have the pieces to be able to execute it.
I'm 100% with you. And I think in the passing game, again, it was finding more and more creative ways to unlock the middle of the field consistently, where they're doing things that I've just never seen before. And I'm trying to come up with specific examples, but it would be hard to describe them without visuals, the ways that they're trying to unlock that space. The problem is, even if you are better at finding ways to unlock that space than any coach alive, and I think that between him and Ben Johnson, those are probably the two guys I would go to, eventually defenses are going to force you to play outside of that, whether or not that's dropping 8, whether or not that's dropping someone down in the middle of the field pretty much every single time you're going to drop back to throw. So what are you going to do in those instances where they're going to take that space away from you? And I just don't have faith in the quarterback to make the most of those situations. One of the numbers that really jumped out to me when I was looking at it, on corners and out routes last year, according to Sports Info Solutions, the only teams with a worse positive play percentage in the NFL than the Dolphins were the Patriots and the Jets. If you're going to force him to throw the ball outside of the numbers down the field, it's probably not going to go well. And if that's just the set of circumstances that you live in, eventually that is going to arise as a problem, no matter how good your coaching staff is at mitigating it through design in the areas of the field you're trying to attack.
Yeah, I think from memory last season, 18% of their targets all season were between 10 and 20 yards in the middle of the field. I've never seen a team ever do that outside. Oklahoma State in college football maybe tried it for 2 years as they just demolishing people with RPOs before people knew what those were. That should never happen at the professional level. That's not like a positive, what a great thing you did. Like that is really limited in the NFL to think you can live with that for a 22-week season. It's just bonkers. You're never going to be able to get away with that. And the only real two solutions you could make as a coach is, okay, we play 5 out and he's just got to spray the ball around. They reveal who's coming. He's got to get rid of the ball really quickly. Or we have a great off-script player. They have neither of those things. Yeah. I really like Tua. I think Tua's development is one of the most undiscussed things of where he was at post hip surgery. This guy completely remade his entire throw mechanics. This is one of the greatest college football quarterbacks of all time, one of the most elite high school recruits of all time with a really peculiar throwing motion, has to completely transform his throwing motion because his hip explodes basically in his final college game. It's incredible. He's even a productive NFL player based on what he went through. But they are really, really beholden to, we have to be a condensed to expand offense. And we're doing that when we can't really attack outside the numbers beyond 10 yards. And it doesn't even make sense when you try and add up how you could get to that philosophically to make it work. The fact they even got it to work somewhat is really impressive.
And I just worry that even with the innovation and even with the ingenuity that we consistently see, are some of those limitations ultimately going to be what dooms them as they get to that stretch of the season every single year? And for as much faith as I have in the staff and for as much faith as I have in what the running game could potentially look like with a little bit more health and with another year to build on what they were already doing, I still can't get that voice out of the back of my head that when it comes down to it, the limitations they have in the passing game are just something that are going to be impossible to ignore in the most important parts of the year.
The thing I admire about them, though, is just the doubling, tripling, quadrupling down the speed. Because one of the things when you watch them is they're able to get the stuff that shouldn't unfurl in the time it takes for things to unfurl. I think people think of the speed as either, yards after the catch, the cheat motion stuff. It's like, wow, it's all happening really quick. They can actually get to really complex switch concepts at like a rate of knots no one else is hitting. So for defensive backs, it's like, wait, that's not supposed to hit that quick. Why are those guys already switching routes? This is impossible. So them saying this is our best approach, we just got to be quicker than everyone else. Things will happen quicker than everyone else. And there is then that somewhat concern in terms of the running out of speed we were talking about at the top over the season is how much extra miles is that adding, pounding on the body with the level of motion, with the speed of the motion? Is it too much? Is that this kind of thing you should hold back? But then you talk yourself into this idea of, so you're saying to a staff, They get in every day. It's 4 a.m., mortgage on the line, job on the line, legacy, reputation on the line. They found something that obliterated the league. They dropped 70 on Sean Payton. And it's like, let's not do that in a really competitive division. Let's not do something we know is excellent because it might run out of steam in week 13. It ends up being nonsensical once you get down to it. Now, maybe there's some stuff they could do to specifically help Tyreek through a season, but it's pro football. He might take a helmet somewhere. Like, you just never know. So to me, the idea of them just like not running what they believe is their offense, like, it's philosophically a part of their offense to move that much and move at pace. You would be changing the entire foundation of the offense to say, let's not do that until we think maybe we're in a playoff race.
I think leaning into that, I'm fine with. I don't know if trading up for running backs as part of that equation is necessary, considering where you could potentially find those guys, but that's neither here nor there. My main issue is not leaning more into the speed, because I think that they should embrace that in the same way that they have. And I'm not even asking them to do what the Rams did. I'm not asking you to have 1,000 pounds of interior offensive line. I'm asking you to meet me somewhere in the middle of those two things. I want to find some point of compromise that can give you more flexibility in your run game, but also still be in line with the identity and the mindset that you want to bring into this offense. I don't think I'm asking too much. I think that's a fair question.
No, I think you go and you get Tyron Smith. You go and try and do what the Jets did. I think that would make a ton of sense. Is just having more seasoned hands around you as guys fall down. You feel confident running your base offense. It is really impressive what he tried to do last year, but trying to wholesale shift your run game and everything that does for you in the play action world, which is your entire offense, like at the midpoint of the season because you've lost guys. It almost undercuts their own argument that we just roll guys off the line and it's a technique-oriented position. It doesn't really make a ton of sense. The way they've invested in the position and how they talk about it based on what they do actually schematically on the field, they don't actually align with the way they talk.
All right, let's get to our next one here, the Buffalo Bills. What is your lingering question from 2023 about the Buffalo Bills?
My question is Sean McDermott's defensive overall here to stay, or will we get old school Sean McDermott next season?
What does that mean for you? That was going to be the first question that I was going to ask you. What do you think the new school is, and what do you think the old school Sean McDermott looks like, and where is the gap between those two things in your mind?
He is just, I don't know what happened to him, whether he just woke up one day, special pot of coffee, found Zim pouches, whatever he's done, he's become one of the new school young kids. They are the most disguise-oriented defense in the NFL. It's like shocking when you watch them now. The rocking and rolling of safeties, all the different movements on the back end, they disguise coverage as much as anyone outside of Spags. That's the numbers. The numbers, particularly in terms of open field coverages. So the most kind of like wonky rolling rotations you could find because you're starting open, you move someone and you end up back at open again. Usually 2 or 3 guys are moving. It was like 30-something% of snaps last year. That is not at all who Sean McDermott's ever been in his entire career. He has been really static, really based around, we just do what we do, execute really well. We'll coach it up. We'll figure it out. Let's try and get turnovers. That's been his whole mode for as long as possible. They've got kind of into the sim and mug world a little bit more. He's got into that train. But the big thing for me is just the disguising. I can imagine him getting into a world of, we've drafted all these guys up front. We've had issues at linebacker. I'll build some new pressure paths. I got that. That's understood. Him just deciding overnight, retaking over control of the defense. I'm now a disguise guy. Based on all the things we know about Sean McDermott, not a guy you think of as like, oh, he'll just have a complete revolution in his mind in one offseason. But he did it. I think he should be really applauded for that.
What do you think would push them back to that world? And because my thought is, if I'm trying to figure out maybe the reasons that drove that more static approach in previous years, you have such smart veteran defensive backs that they're going to be able to play fast enough to overcome offenses maybe understanding what sort of structures you're going to be in. As you step outside of that and you're having to sift more bodies through that defense, you have to be a little bit more unpredictable in order to survive. And now we're going to be in a world where they have unproven young players at some of those spots, guys we've seen before, but it's no longer Trey White in his prime out there. You know, it's Rasul Douglas and Christian Benford. We got Taylor Rapp and potentially a rookie safety back there. This is not the Buffalo Bills secondary of 2018 and 2019. And maybe because of that, he pushes a little bit more to what we saw from him last year than what we had seen from him in those previous couple of years.
Maybe, but most coaches work the inverse, right?
That's
Particularly in
why
the
it's
NFL
surprising to
level.
me. Especially,
Yeah,
I think back to those like Zimmer Vikings days where the only reason they were allowed to live like that is because those guys had spent so long in the system. So that's why it's a little bit surprising that he would go this direction as the component parts were changing more.
yeah. Usually, NFL coaches they're funky beasts. When they get better players, they get more creative. They're like, "Oh, now it's time to have fun." Because I know I can always default to doing the easy stuff. It's when you're rolling in guys when you have injuries, you say, "Okay, we are cooked. Let's just play a bunch of cover one." It's actually the easiest thing to go. I think people think they play Madden. It's like, don't run man coverage. We got bad players. The easiest thing to say is like, follow that guy, cat coverage. Just follow someone everywhere. Chase them as hard as
Exactly.
possible. If it's a penalty, it's a penalty. We'll live and play. So it's actually really compelling that this is when he decided. That's kind of like how I would approach things. My team's not very good. Why not just disguise a bunch of shit? That sounds like a smart way of doing it. Usually, when they do that at the NFL level, they get destroyed. That's why those guys are smarter than me.
Well, there's
So
two
I,
examples I would point to. I remember when Vance Joseph got to Arizona a couple of years ago, and they had the worst cornerback group I had ever seen, and they had injuries on that cornerback group, and they literally were bringing guys just in off the street. So their response to that was, we just have to play man. We just have to play man at a league high rate. And then eventually, when he gets a somewhat more professional group of corners, they had one of the lowest man coverage rates in the entire league. And then you go look at what the Vikings did this year. And their response to not having any players was, we're going to do the weirdest shit imaginable because we know that's the only way for us to survive. So seeing the different approaches when you have a less than ideal set of guys back there is always interesting.
well, that's why Brian Flores is forever the king, because
Yeah.
only he would walk in and even contemplate. I would give anything. Why Hard Knocks was not in the room to see that meeting when he brought it to Kevin O'Connell, and then him just walking out being like, "Did you hear that shit that guy said? Are we really gonna do that?" And then it worked. It worked. The league wouldn't give that guy a head coaching job. Unbelievable. What a guy. Yeah. So I just find it fascinating with everything we know about McDermott. It's not as if he's been somewhere in the middle before. The defense they ran in Buffalo is a defense he ran with Carolina. They didn't change any terminology. They didn't change anything. He plugged and played similar prototypical type players in every single spot he could. They had some better players at safety than he was fortunate to have at certain times in Carolina. But for the most part, it was like a 1-to-1 redux. So for him just all of a sudden to say, I am now in the disguise world and I am in a certain kind of disguise world, him saying I'm going to be a spot drop cover three guy and I'll do some different rotations, I would have got that. That would have been understood and normal. To be an open rate team at the same level as like the Cardinals, the Colts, those are the guys we think of, right? Where we don't really love the guys we have on the back end. We're going to drop back a ton. And so let's try and get a bit quirky on the back end to try and disguise things. For McDermott to shift not only the type of shells he's running, then to drop the disguise and the rotations on top, it was just like a complete personality transplant defensively.
Explain to people a little bit more about open to open rotations. What are you going from and to that make it a little bit harder for offenses to get a beat on you?
Yeah, open is essentially a two high shell, so the middle of the field is open. That's open coverage. Closed coverage is when someone's in the middle of the field, so the middle of the field is closed. And open rotation is you're going from it starting with too high, someone is moving, and you're returning at the end, at the top of the drop of the quarterback. You again have the middle of the field open, so it's a too high or too deep shell. So you have to get two guys rocking and rolling, right? One has to go, one has to replace him. So it's just about essentially adding extra beats into the quarterback's mind. It's just about trying to make some kind of indecision. We discussed this. I think I've been on here a bunch of times talking with you about this has been the meta trend for ages, right?
Mm-hmm.
With Fangs coming back, we are now actually more moving back into let's all move up front. That's where the league's gone now. We started with rolling and disguising at the back. Now once this guy decided we did that, they learned it. They beat us over the head again. Let's all move around up front for a bit until they figure that one out. That's kind of where the league's at right now. So it's just essentially it's mostly about trying to stop play action. That's the idea. That as someone turns their back and you roll, when they reset their feet, they have to reevaluate where the rotation has happened, where everyone is on the field. Try and get this geometric mapping of how has the coverage shell revealed itself. And in that extra time of having to process and figure out, you hope the pass rush comes screaming home. That's kind of the idea. And that's why you'd want multiple rotations. Also, and I don't want to spend too long on this to bore the listeners too much, but the way you roll, not every roll and disguise is created equal because it changes the route distribution. If one guy rolls, it's not always the same. This is why Spags, who has made a living out of, I play Tampa too, but I get there in 16 to 18 different ways on any given Sunday. when you roll, I always say it's concept over coverage. When you put it at the top of the drop, things can look open because it's the same Tampa 2 shell. But the fact that different guys rolled and rotated means that different parts of the route tree would be open at different points in the drop, essentially. So McDermott didn't just have like 2 or 3 or 4 and hey, I've uncovered a quirky side. It was Spags levels of rotations in certain games in the season. So I think he should be admired for that. He has kind of a Neanderthal image, I think, in both football media and fandom because of just the way he approaches life and himself. But that was really like new age stuff for him to do, and I'm fascinated to see if he'll keep it up next season.
Do you think he will?
I never know what Sean McDermott's thinking, or indeed what he will do with his life. So I would never have gathered if you had said to me which one guy is considered old school and will have a schematic transplant in the space of a season, he would have been right at the bottom of my list. So I don't know whether this is just like a philosophical shift where he thinks he can maximize the team, where he's just at with viewing football right now, or as you said, it was just kind of his way of plugging gaps, plugging holes he felt he had in the roster or not.
It's interesting because there's staff turnover. They've lost guys that were huge voices in the way that thing was built. I think John Butler was their passing game coordinator for a while and their secondary coach. He's no longer there. Obviously, Leslie Frazier is no longer there. Bobby Babich is their new defensive coordinator. He was the linebackers coach and he had been on staff, but a lot of the other pieces of the defensive coaching staff are different than they were 2 or 3 years ago. So in my mind, at least from the outside, it does feel like they've constructed things to maybe keep introducing some new ideas and taking this in a different direction rather than reverting back to what they had done over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and that's what was interesting last year. I mean, it was kind of like a power play for him. He kicked everyone out. The Leslie Frazier thing still has not been fully resolved on who said what to whom at what time. He was just like, I'm taking this back over. So when he did that, I immediately thought, oh no, they're going back to everything because they had tried to be a bit more progressive in terms of their pressure game at the back end of the Leslie Frazier run, essentially. And I was like, oh, they're going to return to it's 4 down and here we go. And it's spot drop cover 3. And it's going to be the most predictable defense in the NFL. So for him to take it back and then try and institute the overhaul is pretty interesting.
Let's get to the other side of the ball because my lingering question for the Bills is, was the Joe Brady installation really a cure-all for this Bills offense? Was Ken Dorsey the boogeyman that we all made him out to be? And it's now it's going to be smooth sailing for as long as Joe Brady is there. And I don't want to belabor this. This is a conversation we had in the moment, and it's a conversation that I don't think we have to rehash. I think that Ken Dorsey was unfairly crucified as part of that entire process. The Bills offense was very, very, very good when Ken Dorsey was the offensive coordinator. Their success rate, their dropback success rate with Dorsey was 52.6%. Their dropback success rate with Joe Brady was 46.6%, right? So that's just one number, but on a down-to-down basis, the Bills offense was as good or better when Ken Dorsey was there compared to what it was when Joe Brady was there. The two things that felt different to me in real time, and the numbers end up bearing that out. One, it's not that the run game was better under Joe Brady. I actually think the run game was just as good or better under Dorsey if you look at it on just an efficiency basis. They were willing to run the ball a lot more with Joe Brady than they were under Ken Dorsey. And I thought that those numbers might have been pumped up because of specific games. But even if you remove a game like the Dallas game, you're still looking at a significantly higher rate of how often they were running the ball with Joe compared to how often they were running the ball with Ken. And I think that's important for one specific reason. We've talked so much about kind of slowing Josh Allen's heartbeat and making the game a little bit less frenetic. And if you're willing to lean on that run game as sort of a calming presence in the overall construction and formula of your offense, is that something that has downstream effects for this team specifically that might not manifest for some other teams? And that's why I do think that the more run-heavy approach that Brady took maybe has a more complementary sort of feel to it for this Bills team than it might for a team that we would actually get on them for running the ball as often as they did with the quarterback that they have.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've long held this view that I think Joe Brady is one of the great self-publicists in the NFL. Always happy to speak to wonderful people like Robert Mays and share his fascinating ideas. And I think he gets
I actually don't even know Joe Brady that well, so don't put this on me.
And I really feared when I felt so bad for Ken Dorsey. He just hung out to dry by an embattled head coach who had all kinds of news stories coming out, not to do with football, and was like, you know what's easy? I'm just going to fire the OC and we'll keep it rolling. And I just had this thing in my mind, like, oh, he's going to keep the train on tracks, and then we're going to have a full 6 months of puff pieces about how Joe Brady has transformed everything. And I was well prepared and embedded in my bias that is the approach I will have to take for 18 months to fend off everyone else from the Joe Brady-a-thon. But I have to say, as someone who's been an ardent critic of his style towards professional football, that he changed way more than I actually thought that he would ever do. I thought they would just keep it rolling. It was Josh Allen's offense, and it would kind of be the same, but they probably wind up winning more one-score games, and he would get a bunch of the credit. It's not just the fact that they decided to run the ball, it's what they did when running the ball. They became an all five guys can pull offense, which I'd been screaming out with them forever. That was the huge stylistic change. They added in a bunch more RPO stuff based on that. And it just opened up everything for them. They became an every blade of grass type offense again. When previously they had done that, it had been all in the passing game, right? It had been all super spread offense under Daboll, defend everything. We got Josh downhill if we need him in the run game. And it just put defenses in a complete bind. They'd become a bit more predictable, particularly in the run game under Ken Dorsey. Whereas with Brady, they flipped that completely. Really more creative option type stuff with Josh Allen in the run game, creative quarterback run stuff in the run game, a really cool tackle dart package, which I won't bore people with, but it was just every time they ran it, it was game over. No one knew how to stop that thing. So he did a lot more than I thought he would do. And it's weird because the underlying metrics some of them are pretty ropey compared to the top offense in the NFL once he took over. They were just winning games, and then the kind of top end metrics were stable compared to the Ken Dorsey era. But I liked where they were taking it. And giving him a full off season to then install even more stuff with Allen.
I think that the word I would come back to, and this is obviously something we talk about a lot, is just how dynamic the offense felt compared to the previous version of it. And you talking about the layers of the run game, I think is absolutely right. And the tackle pull stuff it's unique to them. They run that in a way that really no other team in the league runs it. The volume that they run it at, how effective they are at it, and it's very cool to watch. And the other side of that coin is the amount of motion and how they were dressing some of this stuff up felt very different than it did under the Dorsey era. And I think motion for motion sank, and just turning that up for with no actual intention isn't necessarily a good thing. But it did feel like they were dressing things up in a way that made things easier for everybody. And the number that I would come back to with Dorsey, they used motion on 38% of their total dropbacks. With Joe Brady, it was almost 55%. That's a significant departure. And I think that you felt that. And then there are little other kind of wrinkles, like the amount of downfield targets for James Cook in some of those high leverage games, how they were instituting him into the passing game. But I think the long and the short of it is it just felt a little bit more dynamic, and it felt like there were a few more layers to it than it did under Dorsey, even if I do think that Ken Dorsey did a good job as the Bills offensive coordinator.
That's true, but there were other subtle tweaks he made where it was just like, let's just declare ourselves. We have an alien at quarterback. It's like, why are we trying to fool people? They would have like an up man protector. It's like, why are we having the running back in the backfield when everyone knows it's 3rd and 8 and Josh Allen is throwing the football? Who are we trying to get? Let's put an up man in as essentially a 6th offensive lineman, and James Cook can sneak out if we need him to. If anything, he's gaining 3 yards early in the pattern if we need him to. That's a really simple, small tweak that is like, I have a great player. And I probably wouldn't draw this up normally if I'm just like a college OC, but I'm building an offense and scheme to my players.
They did that more with Daboll than they did under Dorsey. Those kind of sniffer packages that they had, that reminds me of like the 2021 Bills, not the 2022 or 2023 Bills.
Yeah, I think my concern for them coming into this season based off the success of last season is I do prefer Allen in a really super spread type offense, in it as wide as possible, give him as much space as possible, as much breathing room as possible, make him the running back threat from the backfield, play 5 out as much as you can conceivably get away with. Whereas you look at them last year, they became ever more condensed when Brady was in there. A lot of that motion stuff is splitting across the formation, trying to create some kind of overload in the run game, then you can flip off it with a quick play action or some kind of smoke RPO. That was where they were kind of getting to, as like extensions of the run game, quick yards after the catch stuff. Them as a truly condensed team. And if you look at the receiver, I mean, all those guys just demolish the middle of the field. That's all their game. That does not scream to me as a 5-out package. Those guys are going to be tight to the formation, or if you're getting wide, it's only to extend the coverage so then you can throw it in behind, right, to Shakir, Knox, on and on, Kincaid. All those guys are going to want to sit over the middle of the field. Keon Coleman is just a true big slot. That's the guy who could maybe extend it slightly, but ideally from inside, I think, rather than being a true perimeter guy. So I'm slightly concerned they're boxed in into being both a condensed team, and then if they are a little bit more spread, their best players attack the middle of the field from inside. It's just not how I would ideally build it out if I had Josh Allen as my quarterback. I think it was a good solution at the end of last season, but they're leaning even more into it, and it's just not the way I would have built that thing out.
Yeah, short-term benefits for maybe long-term concessions that you're making.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, let's get to our next one. New England Patriots. What is your lingering question about the 2023 Patriots?
Should they carry anything over from last year's offense?
I was very surprised that you wanted to discuss this. My quick answer was probably not. I'm sure that yours is more nuanced than that. Where did you go with this?
I just thought it was rewatching it. I don't know why I did this to myself. I blame you.
I don't know why you did this to either of us.
A horrifying few days to have to do this. It was gobsmacking how bad it was in structure, in ideas, in execution, and just running into a brick wall of we've boxed ourselves into how we've built philosophically how we want our offense to function. A 12 personnel timing based offense. And we are quite literally the worst team in the league at all the things we plan to be good at. Unfathomable. It's unbelievable how bad it was. I think the funniest number I found in my entire offseason of going back through, hey, what happened last year? They were dead last in EPA per play last year, or just in total EPA, I should say, with 2 tight ends on the field last year. They were at minus 70 when playing in 12 personnel. The 31st team in the league, the Jets, were at minus 27. Minus 70 with 2 tight ends. They built the entire team being like, we're going back to the good old days. It's going to be 2 tight ends. They're going to split out. We're going to go from tight to wide. It's going to be unbelievable. We'll tempo it. No one will be able to keep up with us. Bill O'Brien's coming in. This will be great. An absolute disaster. And I don't know, Alex Van Pelt comes in. I don't know what your thoughts on Alex Van Pelt, but I've always found him to be one of the most underwhelming game planners, if not play designers in the NFL. I think the funny thing with him that I've always found quite peculiar is when we get into coaching cycles and you see every single team interviews 15, 16 guys, they have absolutely no interest in interviewing like half of those people. When you hire Jim Harbaugh but interview 12 of the guys, it's not like you didn't know you were hiring Jim Harbaugh. That deal was done way before. You do it to gather as much intel as possible, to steal plays, to understand what's happening in other organizations, to just meet young up-and-coming guys for maybe the next time after you fire Jim Harbaugh, the other guy might be interested in hiring. Alex Van Pelt gets no interviews ever. He's been an OC for a long time in Cleveland. Not a single soul considered interviewing this guy on lists of 25 people being interviewed in some places. So that to me is really telling of how the league views where he's at in terms of the pecking order of how it was actually run in Cleveland. They'll have way more intel on who was involved in what in Cleveland. And I think some of the stuff in Cleveland was just like really, really not good enough for the NFL level. So you have a situation where you had one of the most underwhelming, embarrassing offensive performances we've seen in a long time from a team last season, with a guy coming in who I think has to build an entirely new thing from scratch. There is absolutely nothing you want to keep from last season. That is a really, really difficult job for anyone, let alone someone I don't think has kind of a clear, bright, bold, this is my vision for how I play football.
It's interesting because his background is coming from Green Bay. It's like the true blue West Coast stuff when he was living under McCarthy for as long as he did. And then what they did in Cleveland is very different than that, especially just like how play action and the play action heavy and just the run game stuff. So I'm just wondering what it's going to look like. And it really does seem like bringing over, I think Scott Peters is his name, is the assistant offensive line coach from the Browns, is now the offensive line coach for the Patriots. And based on everything that's come out of OTAs is that they're going to be running a lot of that more traditional under center play action based Brown stuff that we saw early into the Stefanski era. I don't know how that's going to go. I mean, I guess it makes sense with what Drake May's skill set looks like, but that is a pretty underwhelming place to land when you draft a guy 3rd overall and you're trying to find the right ecosystem and the right set of circumstances to set him up to succeed.
It's deeply, deeply concerning. It smacks me of an offense you install 3 to 4 years ago before we add all the mini evolutions that have happened so quickly in that time. I think it's going to work. I mean, in Cleveland, they were put into such a bind. They tried to install a really cool forward-thinking balance between wide zone and then boot from under center, but we got all this pistol stuff with Deshaun Watson as well. And just none of it worked because Deshaun Watson was cooked as a runner and then missed basically everything as a thrower when they got there together. And they just had this giant slip between what they were successful at versus what they wanted to be, and just had to decide to lean back into what was actually working in a sense. So to just say we're going back to kind of classic Ramsian type stuff when even the Rams have decided we've moved on from that really quickly. Kevin O'Connell moved on from that really quickly, became way more spread-based teams. Even their run game stuff is different than it was when those guys first got there. If you're going to go back and say, hey, we're a wide zone then boot type team in 2024, it's like you're 4 or 5 years late to the party. Everyone's caught up to that already.
No one's doing that anymore. The teams that lived that way have departed from that. And I think that it is very telling that, and your point about the trying to meld those two worlds with the Browns, that's exactly what they were trying to do. And I think that they did it to varying effect. But going out and getting somebody like Ken Dorsey, who is fluent in those ideas about how to play in that spread out world, that's telling, because they're trying to figure out a better way to bridge those two things than they could when Alex Van Pelt was there. And so for the Patriots to seek out a version of the Browns offense that they were drifting away from, and a version of the Browns offense that the league is drifting away from, and trying to graft that onto a guy who is going to make or break your franchise over the next 10 years in Drake May. It's interesting. We'll see how that works out.
Yeah. And it's just, they've given this guy, he doesn't have this, but it is associate head coach type status, because everyone who stayed with Mayo was a defensive assistant. The only guy who's remained, the only guy offensively who is like the power center now, and Jared Mayo is not going to be running like, hey, this is exactly how we're going to build out the layers of our offense. It's going to be Alex Van Pelt. It's as if he was a de facto head coach on the side of the ball he would want to run if he got the top gig. And I just have no evidence that this is someone who can build out the style of offense I certainly want to see for Drake May, let alone just a successful NFL offense in the first place.
Let's get to the other side of the ball with the Patriots, because mine was, as everything else fell down around them and started to crumble on the other side of the ball, how good was the Patriots defense actually by the end of last year? On a simple level, my answer was very, very good. The Patriots defense still rules. And for them to be as good as they were down the back half, when I want to say that they were second in EPA per dropback after week 10 last year and seventh in defensive success rate. I mean, this was one of the best defenses in the NFL down the back half of the year. That's hard to do when your offense is as bad as it was. You lose morale, things start to fall apart. It's really hard to sustain that level of success on defense, where buy-in and effort are such a huge part of success when things aren't going well on the other side of the ball. That's one part of it. The other is they were dead last in adjusted games lost on defense last year. This was the most injured defense in the league, and somehow they got better in the second half of the season. So like you alluded to, this staff is coming back. I mean, there are a couple guys that you pull out with Belichick and everything else, but the ideas and who they are defensively, I assume there's going to be a lot of carryover from what the Patriots have been and what they're going to try to be. And so going into next year, I feel pretty confident that this is going to be a very good defense, even if all the normal caveats about randomness and on how defense is sticky from year to year and losing Bill Belichick, all of that is correct, but I still feel pretty good about what they're bringing back on that side of the ball after going back and rewatching it.
I agree. I do think it's tough to overlook. We say, oh, somehow they did that. They had the greatest defensive mind who's ever coached football.
That certainly helps.
It really, and the thing that he is so, I don't know if it's misunderstood, underrated, however you would phrase it for, is just the individual technical coaching of every single position.
Yeah.
You watch them, every single player is so fundamentally sound. It's unbelievable to watch them. Everything is tied together so well. You watch all three of the layers, guys missing everywhere. The front is disrupted. The linebackers are all in the right place. They're rolling in these cornerbacks. They're all perfectly technically sound. He does this incredible thing last season of both becoming incredibly complex in terms of the personnel they're running. They're running more personnel packages than anyone in the NFL. Every single drive is a personnel-specific drive. We're rolling everyone through. And yet the individual stuff they're running is really simple. Really, really simple. They start playing a ton of cover one, as we talked about earlier. We don't have great players anymore. Everyone just run around and fight. That's what we're going to do. And we'll roll through packages, and we'll have this really cool 3 safety system. We'll run that more than anyone in the league. And those will be our joker pieces where we can be a little bit more creative in terms of how we get to what we want to get to. But for the most part, 7 of you guys are playing just technical football. Just go play technique the entire game. Technique, leverage, and we'll roll from there. I would hope that staff, as you said, all those guys are carryover guys. Jared Mayo was widely considered one of the true rising stars of coaching. And then it's kind of become this weird thing because he's replacing the greatest ever. But if he had gone to the Panthers or wherever, I think people would have thought it's a home run hire and really exciting. So I hope that stuff carries over. And if that stuff does carry over, and you look at some of the underlying metrics, if the offense is even a little bit better, to the point you mentioned, if the turnover differential levels out, the turnover differential was brutal last year because the offense was so bad. It's unfathomable how good they were down the stretch, given how often they were giving the ball away and how much they were on the field. And then even their other numbers where it's like their pressure rate isn't very high, but they're blitzing a ton. If those things start to balance out one way or the other, right, where you can either cheat an extra guy back into coverage or you actually get the pressure you want based on the amount you're blitzing, all these things point to a team, I think, where the profile might look slightly different next season, but the output should be somewhere similar.
And you can see that happening, right? You get Judon back theoretically, and even if he's a little bit long in the tooth, it's one more body up there. Uche didn't have a good year last year, but we've seen better play from him. I think Keon White has a chance to take a jump this year with more playing time. And Christian Barmore seemed like he was banged up the entire season and was still an effective player. Like, it is not at all hard to imagine a world where that front is significantly more impactful than they were a year ago. And that's before even getting to the secondary. Christian Gonzalez played like 5 games and he was playing insanely well. Marcus Jones barely played last year. So you combine better, deeper cornerback play, better play up front in theory, with those safeties that we're talking about. And on a personnel level, it's kind of hard not to get excited about what they can be. Now, deployment without the greatest defensive coach of all time becomes a more central question, but the pieces that they're working with, I already feel very good about that as a starting point.
Yeah, my only concern is I just don't know how much still at the end, day to day, was Belichick saying we're doing X on down X in situation X. I imagine he was doing pretty much all of it because that's how he's always done this thing. And it's tough to describe to people, this idea that he was like long in the tooth or the game got away from him, particularly with some of the offensive stuff. They were the most, of all the things people say they want defenses to do, the things guys like me and you talk about nerdily on these podcasts, right? Hey, everyone's running these sims and all this stuff. They were doing it to the maximum level. The positionless football stuff, they were doing it to the maximum level, right? Belichick was at the forefront of, we are 3 safeties, we are simming, we are creeping, we are blitzing, we are doing pressure back, we are doing all the fun stuff. They were second in the league at unblocked rate last year. He was just scheming up unblocked guys constantly with players that you wouldn't. They had everyone be like league average to maybe slightly above. He loses all of his true difference maker players throughout the season, and he's still scheming all that stuff up. And it wasn't even really like is this stuff good practice football? Because that stuff will all stay, right? The playbook will stay. Maybe Mayo's got some slightly different ideas, but it was so effective, it would be silly to throw it out. That's why he kept everyone. We want to keep running this stuff. But it's the, as you say, it's the situational play calling. He just had the perfect tenor for when to get really sophisticated and when it was just time to do technique sound stuff. And that is just built over 50 years of football. That's not something you just instinctively have the first day you take a head coaching job.
I think that's exactly right. And to me, it was just how, even watching the little tweaks on stuff and even watching the slight disguises and the thing, it's like, all right, like you mentioned, I mean, they would play, it'd be cover 3, but they would roll the safeties down. So a different guy would be in the post, or they'd be lined up like they were playing man and they would actually be drop back into cover 3. So Kyle Duggar would be walked out over a tight end, but they'd actually play zone behind it. Nothing crazy. It's not all of these moving parts on the back end. It's not what you would think of as a complex defense, but every single slight adjustment or slight tweak situationally made sense. Every single time they did it, you almost have like this wry grit on your face, because even though it is at its core simple, it all is perfectly aligned with what that situation calls for. And that just crept up every single time you would watch them. And when I went back and I watched those couple games last week, that was the prevailing emotion. It's just like, I just kind of like chuckle at how clever it is, but it's not clever for clever's sake.
Yes, there's no bullshit rotations for how smart I am. I cannot stand the coaches who are coaching. Ego coaches is what I call them. They're running stuff to have people post the clips later and say, look how smart these guys are. Belichick has no interest in your clips. He has no time for this. He's trying to win a football game. And everything he does is, and so that what they'll wind up doing is they do that, twice a game. The really, really cool stuff is twice a game. And it's just in the perfect situation. It's just like, how did you know this was the exact right time to pinch the post in that way? It doesn't even make sense why you decided to do that. I've been through your playbook. I've been through your tendency. It makes no sense. How did he know? And just ripping that out it's just going to be really, really tough to replace. But you take out the great coach, they might well have another fantastic play caller in there that we've not seen actually call plays on a Sunday yet. That's perfectly possible. And the talent level will improve. And I do think those things can balance out for them.
Let's get to our last one here. The New York Jets. What was your lingering question about the 2023 New York Jets?
My big thing with them is whether or not they can still continue to have such reliance on their linebackers. I think they might be outside of maybe the Niners, the most linebacker dependent defense in the NFL. Those guys played extraordinary last year, possibly above any level we've expected from CJ Mosley and Quincy Williams. And can that just sustain for another year when you're trying to contend for Super Bowl?
So when you say that they're more linebacker dependent than pretty much every other team in the league, what structurally forces more onto the Jets linebackers than would be asked of them in maybe a different sort of defense?
Well, just the way mechanically they set their defense up, they're probably the most split defense in the NFL, along with the Niners, right? There is not much interchangeability between positions. We are a 4-2-5 defense. We have 4 down linemen. We have our linebackers. We have our secondary. Those are your jobs. We're not getting involved in this new Zen, Feng Wei Zhu, whatever these guys in Baltimore are doing. Nonsense. We don't do that. We have the guys up front. They crush people. We got the 2 roamers in the middle, and then guys cover guys on the back end. That's what we do. And it's even more just like when you watch them, the gutsiness of how they like fit the run of we don't give a shit if you have 6-7 bodies in there offensively. We play with a 4 wide split front. It's basically like, just fuck you. That's how we play. These guys play 4 wide and we have 2 linebackers and just go and attack. So that puts a big.
That is a huge departure from where the league is going and where most of the league is right now. If you talk to offensive coaches, and honestly, I think that's part of the reason that the Browns have had such good success against them is because that team specifically loves understanding where the front is going to be. But most teams that aren't as good at picking away at that level of simplicity, they can't take advantage of it. But the fact that they're willing to play like that as often as they are really does show a level of ballsiness that most teams in the league do not have right now.
And just no compunction about like, let's maybe change it slightly. Just like, no,
this is what
I did this in San Francisco. Just go find me players. That's what Robert Saleh said to Joe Douglas. Find me the players. This is how I run the defense. But the other thing they do, which kind of overlays with that point slightly, is what they're doing with the single mugger of just setting one linebacker down the line scrimmage without zero intention of being involved in the play. That's not what you're there for. You're not involved in the pressure. You stand at the line of scrimmage to set the protection. We know we're predictable. We're going to make you predictable. That's what they do with their single mugger package. So just the depths you have to move to as a linebacker. It's like, I know I'm in coverage. I have to pick up the slot guy. I have to get out of there so quickly. And I'm a huge human being running after that slot receiver, bouncing from the center to 12 yards of depth. Just the bind they put those guys in. Now they do only really allow them to play in this kind of vertical plane, right? It is all front and backs. They're not demanded in that sense, but it's a real big responsibility compared to some of the other defenses in the NFL that you have to match things vertically. You have to match things vertically whilst playing head up over the center, right? And you have to fake and bluff like you might blitz, but then you're dropping out to pick someone up running the pole. That's huge. And then if you're just playing, as we said, and it's kind of a 4-2 box and you're fingering the run and there's 7 guys in there for the offense, like, again, it's just a really, really difficult assignment. So to put that kind of onus on those guys and for those guys to play as well together, Mosley and Williams, as they did last season, above what I would say would be anywhere near their career average, to expect to get that again from those 2 guys, for there to not be an injury, for a replacement to be anywhere near that level, it made sense in San Francisco. He was dealing with all-time players. You could do that. I don't know if you can expect that same degree of output from those guys next season.
So I guess that would be my question. Why do you think it might not be sustainable? It's just that you don't think that they're capable of playing at that level again, just by simple variance?
Yeah, well, I think Quincy Williams is really, really talented. Mostly there's age, there's health concerns, and there's just a point where, at what point do we come to predict now that the pressure stuff that they get those guys to be involved in, right, of the single mugger package, that's just a textbook thing where there's not actually a solution for that. You know, you can't just say like, oh, we'll find a twist to make it work. They just have, it's just a 1-to-1 fight then at the line of scrimmage who's got better players. There's not like a thing you could do to try and offset the single mugging package.
So what you're talking about there is they'll literally just walk one of those linebackers down and put him over one of the guards. So you still have your 4 down linemen. One of them, there's 3 on one side and there's a linebacker and then the defensive end on the other side. So you guys can imagine it. It's where one linebacker is walked down compared to those 2 guys mugged up in the A gaps.
Yeah, and the one they really like to do is to split the front. So you have 2 really wide defenders. You have 2 interior guys pushed a little bit wide, and then they put they drop a linebacker down to one side of the center rather than head up, which would be the traditional 5 across. And all that is to do for the listeners is it forces the offense you as a defense are telling the offense you have to be in a certain protection. The only way to block that, what would be the modus operandi of an NFL offense, is we just got to go man-to-man because we don't know if that guy's coming or not. So we'll go 5-0. And by setting the protection, by making it man-to-man, when the Jets, who stunt and twist at the highest rate in the NFL, you now know they're blocking man-to-man, essentially. And stunting and twisting is designed to have those individual blockers pick one another to get a guy coming free. That's why you stunt and twist. So it is just setting for the defense, knowing we're going to get the perfect protection we want to attack. You set the protection so you can attack it. That's what they're doing with that. I just don't know if you can expect two guys to play. They both played, I would say, at a top 10 linebacker level in the NFL last season individually. To expect to get that again, when I just don't think they are necessarily. I think Williams is really talented. I don't know if Mosley can play at that level for a second season.
So in your mind, what is the way to protect them a little bit more while still living in the defensive world that you want to if you're Robert Saleh?
I think you'd probably want to become more dime oriented and try and sub an extra safety in there where possible, particularly for some of the coverage stuff. But I think you would end up being way more predictable. You would lose some of the flexibility. The degree of flexibility they have is that we ask our linebackers to do everything, right? Is that they're there to fit the run, they're there to run the pole, they're there to blitz. If you start saying we become more of a formational, situational defense, you're giving back the advantage you have by saying we have guys who can do everything. The brilliance of Fred Warner is not only that he may be the best player on earth, is that he can do everything, meaning you never have any idea what they're running because you can't get a tell from where Fred Warner is on the field. So it becomes this like trade-off game of how do we protect our guys versus making ourselves too predictable, particularly in the coverage space, where we can then just get ripped apart.
It's interesting because Chuck Clark has played in a role like that in the past where it's not a projection to kind of have him walk down as a dime linebacker if you want to take CJ Mosley out in some of those moments. And they have Ashton Davis there who got some playing time last season. So even with who moved on? Jordan Whitehead. Even with Jordan Whitehead not in the picture anymore, you still have three safeties that you could realistically kind of rotate between if you wanted to drift a little bit more towards that world. But I understand that there are drawbacks that come along with that. Let's get to the other side of the ball. Mine for the Jets. And this came about because I was in Japan a couple weeks ago and I was talking to a Jets fan and we were talking about Aaron Rodgers and expectations. And he was asking me, he's like, do we even really remember how good Aaron Rodgers was the last time we saw him play football? Like, what's a realistic expectation for what he can be, even if, let's say, that player is coming off an Achilles injury? And I thought, you know what? I've done this before where I went back and watched Aaron Rodgers in 2022, but it's been a while. So I might as well, rather than go back and watch the 2023 Jets offense, which I would never wish on any human being in America, I might as well go back and kind of refresh my understanding of what Aaron Rodgers was near the end in Green Bay. So I watched a few games in the back half of that season, including the last game of the year against the Lions. And my takeaway about what Aaron Rodgers was is not dissimilar to other conversations we've had about him over the last couple of years. I think physically, this is pre-Achilles, obviously, there is still everything you'd want to see. Every club is still in the bag. The arm strength is there. The creativity is there. I know the deep ball numbers were really bad in 2022, but I think that partially that's because, as Nate used to put it, there were a lot of performative deep balls involved in that equation where he's just saying fuck it and tossing it up there. When they actually wanted to push the ball down the field as part of the offensive plan, he's still able to do it. He can still drive the ball. He can still move enough. My biggest question about him, this is part of that performative deep ball concern, and it's part of something that I think is always going to be something that has to come up with him. It's how engaged is he? Because watching him in 2022, it looked like someone who could physically still do it, but had no interest in playing within the structure of the offense and doing what the offense asked him to do. So is that going to be the set of circumstances that we go into this season with? Is he somebody that can still do it, but at times doesn't care to play within the structure of the offense and what the offense is asking him to do? That's kind of my main question about what sort of player Aaron Rodgers can still be.
Yeah, it's almost impossible to answer without sitting down
There's
with
no
the
way.
guy. And even then, you may not have any idea. It's one of the most bizarre things. When you go back and rewatch that season, I couldn't help but feel for Matt LaFleur, because what he wound up in this bind where this guy is refusing to pull the trigger on certain concepts.
Yes.
And he's basically decided, I like 10 plays. And I will engage with those 10 plays, to your point. And you mentioned the deep ball numbers. The amount of slot fades they're throwing with like 3 yards to go indicates that he said, I'll throw that ball all day long. Don't ask me to do anything else. And you can see the staff ending up in a bind of, do we change the offense with a guy who seems pissed off at everything we say and everything we ask him to do and refuses to throw to wide open players on stuff he just decides, I'm not interested in throwing that today? Or do we just keep banging our heads against the wall on certain things that aren't working because he's hitting it in fits and starts? That was the big thing. Just the consistency was eroded from his game. That, as you said, every club was still there. You saw Aaron Rodgers in snapshots in every single game, aside from the one when he initially hurt the thumb. But it was just, the consistency was just completely gone. It evaporated away. And so I don't know what we can expect to get this season. And I find it mind-boggling in terms of the conversation around him and his engagement with the team and not going to mini camps and spending time on podcasts and all this kind of stuff. What they ran in Green Bay, I actually think, Mays, it will be lost to time. Hopefully not. Hopefully we've got the great Robert Mays and he'll do a podcast series on this at some point down the line. What LaFleur, Hackett, and Rodgers built for those 2 MVP seasons, I think is the most extraordinary offense in terms of design, and also production was outstanding. I think Peyton, McVay, and that offense is the most instructive thing we've seen in a long time. What he was able to get Rodgers to do in wedding what his instinctual game is and giving it a sense of timing and structure. So he feels like he's freelancing, but really there's a whole bunch of structure built in to make the whole thing sing, and then to just destroy the entire league with it was incredible. And then for him to decide, I have no interest in doing that anymore. I've decided I'm not good with this thing, this beautiful artistry you've built for me. I'm no longer interested. If that's what they're taking to New York with the Jets, I cannot tell people the complexity of what they ran. It doesn't even make sense that they pulled it off structurally. It's bizarre. The time and effort it would take to install that somewhere else with a guy who physically may be eroding, right? Where he might not be able to move around as freely, might not be able to extend plays as freely. It just doesn't make any sense. You would have to spend every single waking minute trying to install that thing with a new group of guys. To spend any time doing anything else is a dereliction of quarterback duty. You have to be there trying to get everyone to understand the rhythm and timing of these things. It's not an offense like anything else anyone has ever run before. So you can't just walk into another building, bring that Hackett with you, chuck it up on the sidelines, and think it's going to work.
Well, so here's my thing. One, I think that him missing minicamp, I think a lot of people are going to be like, oh, it's not a big deal. Guys do this all the time. We're talking about his level of engagement being the most important factor about whether or not he has been successful over the last 4 or 5 years. And this is when he was healthy. So the fact that there's even a glimpse of him not being as engaged as he could be matters more for him than it does for anybody else. And that's before we even get into the complexities of the offense. My question, though, about the complexities of the offense is, he no longer has to live within that structure if he doesn't want to. That marriage that he found with Matt LaFleur, I'm 100% with you. To me, is one of the most beautiful football compromises that I've ever seen. And the end result on the other side of it was incredible to watch. But now he's unshackled. He no longer has to live in that compromised world and meet Matt LaFleur halfway. You bring Nathaniel Hackett along. Nathaniel Hackett doesn't come from that world. Nathaniel Hackett is a true dyed-in-the-wool West Coast guy in the same way that Aaron Rodgers is. So that, to me, feels like the world that they're going to want to live in. And that's another question that we have yet to see answered because we saw him play for 4 plays. What is this going to look like? Well, we don't even know that yet because we still have not seen it in practice.
But it just, honestly, it makes no sense. Right. Even if you think Aaron Rodgers is hard-headed, free thinker, philosophizer, however he brands himself, right? If you were just the best in your craft, in whatever field you live, you worked with someone, you were handed the cheat code. This says how, with your skills, it makes you the best in your field, and you then get given a startup opportunity. You can go run your own operation. You wouldn't want to run the thing that made you the best in your field?
No.
It doesn't make any sense. Why would you not want to do that?
Are you surprised? If he ends up going back and we see a version of the offense that looks more like it did at the end of the Mike McCarthy era than it did when he won multiple MVPs with Matt LaFleur, would that surprise you?
No, it's what I actually expect at this point based on the way he talks in public. It just doesn't make any sense logically for a guy who cares a lot about what people think about him and his reputation and how he'll go down and be remembered in the league. If you did the Brady thing, which is I'm going to take my ecosystem somewhere else, I'm going to win. It does wonders for you. It gets all the stuff you wanted to get at the place you were at before. Tom Brady didn't go down there and say, we're running the spread option now. I want to spread my wings. This is how I see football. He took his entire offense, all his friends. They went down to the sunshine. They beat everyone. Why that wouldn't be the play? But the big thing with Rodgers too is he's never been a true grip it and rip it rhythm thrower. Now, when he's done that, he's been as good as anyone. It's one of the most incredible things about him is he could basically play any style he wanted at the peak of his powers and be the best. That was just who he was at the apex of things. But if he's going to be in any way constrained by the Achilles, and he has to be constrained by the Achilles, he's 40 years old, coming off an Achilles surgery. He is not Brady-esque, where it's just going to be hit the back foot, get the ball out, and spray it around. He's going to want to be able to move. And if he's going to be a hit the back foot, get the ball out type thrower, the reps that takes to relearn some of that stuff, it's different body mechanics in the way he throws the ball right now. So again, you're down to how are you spending your time? We've got to build in new route structures because you're changing the mechanics of how you throw the football. You have to relearn how to throw the football in certain ways because you're running different stuff now. You become a rhythm-based thrower rather than a less timing-based artist. That's just time and reps. And you're offered precious time and reps by the team. Please come in, minicamp. Work out with the guys, and he decides not to do it. None of it adds up for the way he actually talks about, who he wants to be, how he wants to play the game.
I think that the takeaway here is that you go back and watch Rodgers from 22. There are elements of it that would give you confidence, enthusiasm about what this could look like, but there are just as many elements of it that would give you pause. And those aspects of it, whether it's engagement, whether it's wanting to play ball, whether it's wanting to live within the structure of the offense, those are big enough concerns combined with the way that he has approached certain things over the last year, 18 months, that I think should give Jets fans, if not a sense of dread, then, a sense of worry about what this could end up looking like.
Yeah, then the person I feel sorry for the most in all this is Robert Saleh. The pressure on that guy. This is a guy who's never in a championship building. He now has a 1-year run. So he has to try and get this guy to engage. So he goes to the podium. My quarterback's not turned up for practice. Okay, we got to find him. What am I going to tell people? These are new experiences for a guy who's never been through this heat before. This level of you have to win it all right now. He kind of got a slight pass on it last year. We expected that to be the way it would go, right? Where every single week is, how's he doing? What happens if a young player has a down year? All the things that happen on this roller coaster to try and win a championship, and what a coach has to do to navigate through the building, let alone all the on-field stuff that goes with it. He was able to get a mini do-over of getting through last year because of the Achilles tear. Now we have to see it again, and he's not even getting like the promised goods they got when they first made the pact, which is at least I'll feign being interested.
Yeah,
my
exactly.
friend with me. It is a really, really tough situation for him.
All right. That is all we got. Fantastic division, fantastic conversation. Ollie, I sincerely appreciate you joining us. Where can the people hear you, read you, and engage with more of the stuff that you're doing?
They can read me on theguardian.com. What Mina Kimes' father once called the New York Times of Europe, which we very much appreciate. So they can go and read me on there, or you can read super football nerdy stuff on thereadoptional.com.
I subscribe and am a voracious reader of everything that Ollie puts out because he does a fantastic job. So you guys should absolutely check it out. For now, that is all we've got. We will be back on Friday with our next version of the Lingering Question series. We're doing the AFC West with my buddy Derek Klassen. So please be on the lookout for that. Please come back and join us. For now, that is all we've got. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. We'll talk to you soon.